Hi folks, in this tutorial we'll be looking at doing something like No Man's Land, a muddy expanse between trenches with barbed wire and dead grass. Well, something to that degree anyway. So grab yourself a cup of tea and let's get started. The first thing I'm going to be doing in this tutorial is to take some model filler. Now this can be any filler of your choice or even green stuff. And the idea of what I'm doing here is, as a main point, covering up that easy to build peg hole that happens to be on this base. But I'm also going to create a difference between the flat area of the base and some slightly raised areas. Now the thing about ground is, well, it's not flat, and the thing about plastic bases is they're flat. So we want to give the feel of this war-torn, muddy, gloopy field sort of feel. So when I apply some texture paint over the top of this, once this is dried, it's going to give us a nice variation in levels as well as texture. You will need this filler or putty or whatever you choose to use to be fully dried before we do the next step. This stuff takes about an hour, but your solution may vary, so make sure that it's dried before we go on to the next step of the tutorial. Once the filler has dried, I will then be coming in with some Stirland mud texture paint from Games Workshop. This is a gritty texture thingy that's already been pre-painted brown, which is great for this sort of thing, since it allows us to get that nice earthy texture on nice and quick. If you don't have texture paint, then you can use sand and paint it brown, but I quite like the texture paint and they're really convenient. So it's just a matter of coating all over this in a nice thin layer. You can apply it thicker over the raised filler and or putty areas if you want, and keeping it thin on the bits that are just the plain base, and that should give you a nice variation in ground levels. Once the texture paint is dried, it should look something like this. As you can see, the addition of that filler has really made a difference in showing off different levels of ground texture. Next, I'm going to apply a black wash all over this base to enhance all those recessed details left by the texture paint. I'm using Nuln oil from Games Workshop, but any black wash that you have will do. If you have a gloss black wash, you may choose this here to really emphasize wet mud appearance. I am applying this neat straight from the pot, and this is a stage where we definitely don't have to worry about being neat. Once the wash has been applied, we can put it to one side to dry for about 20 to 30 minutes. We really want to make sure it's dry before the next step. Once the black wash is dried, it should look something like this. Next, I'll be coming in with some Gorthor brown from Games Workshop, and we're going to start dry brushing onto this base. We're going to build up a few layers of colours with this, and these layers that I'm going to do here are entirely optional. If you want to keep a really dark, muddy appearance, then you can leave it as is and skip this dry brushing step. If you want the ground to look a bit more clay-like, that's been churned up, then these dry brushing steps will be for you. To dry brush, I'm using a paper towel to remove most of the paint from the bristles of my brush, and then I'm going backwards and forwards over the base itself, picking out the raised detail. The trick with dry brushing is to build up the colour softly and slowly, because it's very difficult to take away if you put on a huge splurge of colour, and the transition won't look as nice as if you've built it up in slow layers. Next, I'll be using some Karak stone from Games Workshop for a final dry brush highlight. This is the step that really makes it look like churned up clay on this base. The idea here is you want to focus on the very highest raised points and little bits to focus in on some detail. If you apply this all over the base, then you will start to tint the colour and start to lose that muddy appearance. So Be careful with this and basically apply to taste. For the next step, we are going to add some barbed wire to this no man's land base. Here I'm using some brass etched razor wire from Secret Weapon Miniatures, but there are other brands available. And I do recommend that you prime and paint this whilst it's still on its sprue, so that it makes it easier to get to, because once it's on the base it can be very difficult to paint this, and you don't want to be getting any sort of silver or rusty coloured paints onto the soil that we've already done. Now the thing about barbed wire or razor wire on a battlefield is that it will be coiled. So to do this, we're going to use the end of a paintbrush and wrap the razor wire slowly round it. Just place it under your finger and then very slowly curl it around it. The brass nature of this should mean that it should keep its form really nicely, and you'll be left with a small coil of wire. The more wire you cut, the longer this coil will be. And the nice thing about brass is that you can stretch it or squish it to make it into different shapes, and it will still retain that. It is quite pliable and very easy to use. To fix the razor wire to the base, we're just going to use some small dabs of super glue at the contact points of where we want the brass wire to be. It shouldn't take too long to dry, and I would recommend trying to use as little super glue as possible here. And I would avoid using any form of activators because we don't want to risk any fogging or clouding of the glue, spoiling the muddy effects that we've placed already. Once the razor wire has been affixed in place with the super glue, we're then going to add some static grass to this base. To keep the no man's land feel going, I have chosen a very brown dead grass, and this will be really useful to hide any glossy surfaces left by the super glue for the razor wire, but also provide some nice colour contrast to stop it looking too monotonous in tone. Static grass has quite a clumpy nature and is a very fibrous material, and we're going to take advantage of its properties to create some barren tufts left over from decades of fighting in a wet, muddy environment. To attach the static grass, I'm going to be using bog standard PVA glue. This is a big old cheap tub from Hobbycraft, but pretty much any white PVA glue that you want to use will suffice. So here I've put a small amount onto the Sistel texture spreader, but you can use an old paintbrush or your finger or whatever you have lying around really. This is just something we use to put small amounts of this glue onto the base. This is where we want small bits of grass to be showing through the mud. To apply the static base, I have pinched some of the fibres between my finger, dabbing it onto the areas with the glue and pulling upwards. I'm then going to tap off and blow the excess, which should leave us with some nice tufts of grass standing upwards. And you can apply as much or as little as you want here, but I'm only using a small amount just to provide some tone variation. Once you've applied the static grass, it should look something like this. In the last step of this tutorial, I'll be adding some puddles to the no man's land. Here I have decanted some Woodland Scenics realistic water into a small dropper bottle, but there's about 1,000,001 different realistic water products out there on the market, so work with the ones that you have access to. They all work slightly differently, so make sure you follow the instructions on the bottles. To use the realistic water, I'll be applying a small drop onto an area where I want there to be a puddle to form. And I'm just going to be applying a small amount here, and I'll be building this up in layers. The real trick with any realistic water product is to only apply a small amount at a time, and then wait for it to dry, and then apply a new layer on top of it. The realistic water effect does take many hours to dry, so please do make sure that this step is dry before you apply the next layer. If you don't have access to any realistic water products, you could use gloss varnish for this step, especially if you used a gloss wash earlier in the tutorial, because we're just looking for that shiny effect to give the impression of water. With the water effects dried, the edge of the base painted and a figure attached, This base is now complete. If you haven't already subscribed, consider doing so for updates on further tutorials just like this one. I hope this helped with your modelling, and I'll see you in the next one.